Let's get joined up. This week's show is sponsored by Bandcamp.com, an online record store and music community where passionate fans discover, connect with, and directly support the artists they love. There's thousands of bands and artists on there, including my band, the Rye Dogs, whose second album, Pigs Might Fly, is out right now. Here's a quick snippet of the title track, which is also available on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Music.
Because your eyes may be weeping, but your conscience is sleeping. So baby, don't you cry. Your faces are drying and you say...
It's totally free to join Bandcamp, and as the Rye Dogs are brand new members, we're now looking to grow our fan base, so your support would be greatly appreciated. Just search the Rye Dogs, that's W-R-Y Dogs, and hit the follow button. Right, now we can cue the theme tune.
Joined up writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 175, can you believe that? With Joey Hartstone, successful screenwriter turned debut novelist with his legal thriller The Local. Joey and I talk about his journey from writing for the screen to becoming a published author, finding stories that matter to you, and why he outlines so thoroughly before starting a project. Very brief catch up from me this week because my day job is nuts and I'm hopping between a million things. As I speak, it's only been a day or so since the world cinema premiere of No Fair, the Sean Green story, which is the feature-length documentary myself and director Matt Holt have been working on for more than 6 years. It played to a sellout audience and it's got a couple more showings as well, but it played to an audience that also included the documentary's central figure Sean and her family, who were all watching it for the first time. So it was a very emotional evening, and the reaction we got during the film and afterwards has been amazing. Why am I going on about this, apart from obviously a serious case of humble bragging? Well, really, it's just to reiterate yet again to both myself and to anyone out there who needs to hear it, that achieving any kind of career or success in a creative field is built on perseverance and somehow drawing on reserves of stamina that you didn't know you had. This project, for example, has been entirely self-funded by myself and Matt's tiny production company. It's literally just the two of us, Spoon Jar Films, using money we've made working on, well, let's just say less creatively rewarding projects, things like corporate video and branded content. And despite having almost 20 years of production experience, we're not film or TV insiders. We're totally outside the industry, and we've faced rejection every single step of the way. And to be totally honest, I was ready to give up sort of 3 years ago and begged Matt to agree to just put the film out for free on YouTube. But maybe everything happens for a reason, because the extra time actually improved the film. It gave the story a more interesting arc, and ultimately we got to give an amazing shared experience to a few hundred people. And this is only another small step on the journey, with more limited cinema screenings planned, and the next challenge is going to be to go back to some of those TV commissioners that turned us down in the first place and try to find a longer term home for the film. But anyway, we're celebrating success and we're using it as fuel for the next grueling stage of the marathon. And I'm trying to take the same ethos into the other areas of my writing and creative projects, to celebrate every win, no matter how small, and ultimately to keep doing the work, so that if and when an opportunity does arise, I'm in the best possible shape to take it. And it's a sentiment that's also echoed in today's chat with Joey. So get in touch with me to share your success, or just vent your petty frustration. It doesn't really matter. And to get in touch, tell me what you've been up to as well, and you can feel free to ask questions or whatever. And the best way to get in touch is via email, wayne@waynekellywrites.com, but you can also tweet me at JU Podcast or drop me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk. It's totally free, and you'll even get a couple of downloadable goodies when you sign up, and you'll be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Okay, let's hear today's interview with Joey Hartstone. So Joey is a film and television writer who, as you'll hear, often wishes he was a lawyer. He's got a master's degree in screenwriting and has written 2 feature films, LBJ and Shock and Awe, as well as working as a television writer and producer on the Good Fight and Showtime's legal thriller Your Honor, which was brilliant, by the way. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife and son, and The Local is out right now everywhere you can find great books. So enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end for a sign-off.
Joined up writing.
Okay, Joey, thanks so much for joining me on Joined Up Writing. Really appreciate it. So why don't you start off just telling us where you're speaking from, first of all, and give us a sense of how things are going.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I am in Los Angeles. It's about 8 o'clock in the morning and things are going great. Nice
early start. Have you had your breakfast yet?
I have a 15-month-old, so I get up pretty early.
Yeah, you've been up for hours.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I feel your pain. My daughter's grown up now, but I remember it well. So yeah, why don't we start off? You just tell me a little bit about your debut novel, The Local, which I'm reading at the moment and loving, by the way. It's great.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, it's a legal thriller, and basically about 5 or 6 years ago, I was having drinks with a friend of mine from college who is an intellectual property lawyer, and he works in Boston, Massachusetts, and he was in LA doing a deposition, and he said he was going to this small town in Texas next. And I asked him why he was going there, and he said, I actually go there all the time because there's this little place, and it happens to be sort of the epicenter of intellectual property rights, intellectual property law in the United States, and that there's more patent infringement lawsuits in this tiny Texas town than anywhere else in the country. So I was immediately intrigued, and he started to tell me all these really interesting stories about all these big city legal teams that go to this small town and they defend major corporate clients. But sort of the trick of this place is convincing the local juries to side with you. And what it takes to do that is a local attorney. So there's all these lawyers in East Texas who join these patent litigation teams, and they just sort of have small roles, but vastly important in communicating with the jury. And so that sounded like a really interesting character to me. And I kind of tossed it around for a couple of years, and I thought maybe I would pitch it as a TV series, but I couldn't quite get the story. And then finally I thought, I have to move this eventually out of intellectual property law and into something a bit more entertaining, like criminal defense law, and maybe have a murder. And so that's when I realized I had an actual story that could sustain a novel. And then I had a little bit of free time 2 years ago before my son was born, and I thought maybe I should write this as a novel, and that way I can at least tell the story the way I want to tell it.
Yeah, absolutely. So give us a sense of the actual premise. So you mentioned there that there's a murder. What happens to your main character? It's Jimmy
Sure.
Euchre, isn't it? Is that right?
Jimmy Euchre, yeah. So he's a local attorney in East Texas, and this is sort of what he does. He joins these big teams. He kind of gives a big opening and a big closing statement, and then he goes home and he drinks by himself, and that's sort of the life he's been leading the past few years. And his only friend in town is the federal judge who sort of runs this patent litigation industry here, and he gets murdered. And then the person who's accused is James's new client, who was being sued for patent infringement here, and he kind of had an outburst in court. He yelled at the judge, and then that night the judge ended up dead. And a lot of signs point to this defendant as the possible killer. And so James is not he's not a criminal defense attorney, but his client has sort of been persuaded that if you want to convince people in this town to side with you, you need somebody who's from this town to be your advocate. So even though that pitch was designed to get him to hire James for patent litigation needs, he sort of flips it and says, I want you to be my lawyer, or part of the legal team for my criminal defense. And so James takes the case sort of begrudgingly, but he does it in part because he's always wanted to know if he could do what his father did and be a big time criminal defense attorney. But also he wants to find out who actually killed his mentor and whether or not that was his client or not. And he thinks taking this case might be the only way he can get some definitive answers.
Absolutely. So he's faced with lots of different decisions and choices to make. So yeah, as I say, I'm currently reading it. I'm loving it, and it's kind of got a very cinematic kind of page-turning feel to it. So, given your history as a screenwriter, which we will get to at some point, but were you ever tempted to write it as a script, or maybe it started out that way? You did kind of mention that you were thinking of with the setting, you were thinking of a TV series or something.
Yeah, I wanted to. I've been working in TV for the past, say, 5 years, and sort of when I'm developing my own projects, instead of being hired on somebody else's TV show, what usually happens is I spend a lot of time kind of conceiving of the idea and then pitch it to various companies, and either nobody buys it or someone buys it, and I get hired to write the first episode, and then it usually doesn't go any further than that. And it has it's still a good job, but it has become kind of creatively unfulfilling because you know, you think about what you want the first 5 or 10 episodes to be, and the more you live with it, the more excited I get to write those, and then I never get the chance. And so once I kind of knew what this whole story was going to be, I got worried that if I did go that route, I'd never get to write the whole thing. So I thought, well, let me write the novel, and then even if it doesn't go any further than my own computer, I'll have written the whole story. It'll be a fulfilling task as a writer, and I'll be able to pitch it better, and then hopefully it'll be a TV series anyway. But let me at least try and tell the story the way I want to, and then luckily I was able to share it with enough people, and some people liked it.
Which is good. I mean, and a lot of people outside, you know, that haven't got any experiences of screenwriting or anything like that, they'll probably be surprised to hear that what you've just described there, the fact that there's, you know, it's kind of a job in itself, kind of writing the first script of things that then subsequently, unfortunately, don't get to make it into full development or whatever, or full production, should I say. So tell us a little bit more about that and how you kind of deal with that. Obviously, you get paid for that, for the time that you not for the development that you do off your own back, but you get paid for some of those things. But as you say, it must be difficult from a kind of dealing with rejection point of view.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely make a living writing in Hollywood and never have anything make it onto the screen. And there are worse ways to make a living, but obviously you want things to get picked up and to go forward. And so I've been really fortunate because I've worked on 2 shows, The Good Fight and Your Honor. And so while I've been doing that, I've also been able to develop some things on my own. And projects can take a couple of years to get going, and then they can sit there and then get resurrected and buried again, and all kinds of crazy things. But yeah, so I think I've tended to gravitate towards limited series right now, usually based on true stories. And so I do a lot of research, a lot of reading about these historical figures. And since they are true stories, and it's usually conceived as a one season show, I know the whole story and I know where it's going to go. And then, I build these things into the first episode, and I get very excited about paying them off down the road. And then usually I don't get to do that. So that can often be the process, is that you have this idea, you pitch to a bunch of production companies, hopefully you partner up with one of them, then you pitch to studios and networks. And if you're lucky, you at least get a shot to write that script and try to turn it into a show. But so far I haven't turned anything into my own show yet. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, the dream eventually.
Exactly.
So let's go back a little bit. Let's tell me a little bit about how you actually came to writing in the first place. Do you remember what's your earliest memories of writing or finding some kind of enjoyment in writing? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think really my earliest is sort of around like 2nd grade, and my parents got divorced, and then I wrote a story about a little boy whose mom died, and then my teacher and my mom both started crying. And I didn't even realize in my own 8-year-old psyche that that's how I was processing my parents' divorce, that it was like the death of a parent to me for some reason, even though I still saw both my parents all the time. But I do think that I don't know if I was any good at it. I'm certainly not at 8 years old, but I think it was definitely a skill I had to learn. But it was certainly a way that I wanted to express myself, and it just sort of naturally, that was how I did that. And then it wasn't until sort of the end of college when I had wanted to go into politics or the law, and I just kind of got disheartened by both of them. And I took a screenwriting class, and I'd always loved movies, but it had never occurred to me that I could actually do something in that industry. And I had a great professor named Mark Weinberg, who was a visiting professor at my school, and he encouraged me to come out to LA and to pursue this. And I'm really glad that I did. Yeah,
that's great. So as you say, so you kind of gone, that's kind of how you got into writing, and it's refreshing actually, because ironically, a lot of the guests that I have on here, they all start off really wanting to write, or they're interested in writing, then they go through college and they nearly always end up doing something that's not writing. I often find they go into sciences, or like, as you said, the law. I've spoken to a couple of people that became lawyers and then
and then were unfulfilled, and they ended up coming all the way full circle and then writing that book that they wanted to write. So you actually did stick to your guns, and you kind of went that way with it. And
I mean, to be fair, I wanted to go to law school. I think I just didn't have the fortitude to actually spend 3 more years in school.
That's a lot of hard work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there is that as well. I can, same goes for people that can stay in school long enough to become doctors and things as well.
Definitely.
But obviously, you're kind of living out your fantasies. One would argue now that you're writing, your first book is a legal, courtroom drama. It's a legal thriller or whatever. So on that subject, and you've kind of alluded to it with some of your screenplay projects and things. Research is obviously a big part of what you do, and I can tell just from the sort of first half or whatever I've read of The Local that research is a big part of what you do, and that there's obviously a lot of, well, at least it reads accurately to me. I mean, I'm not that au fait with the Eastern District of Texas law, but it seems like you know what you're talking about. You're doing a good job of convincing me. So tell me about the research side of things.
Yeah, like I said, I have tended to do true stories at least in the movies that I've written, and so even though this is certainly a work of fiction, it's based on a real area, it's a real town. They really do this type of law there. There was a real judge that the judge I wrote was based on, and yeah, I've never, when I didn't see Star Wars until I was in college. Like, I grew up watching, I love television and movies, but I was only basically allowed to watch whatever was on that my dad was watching. So I grew up watching LA Law and MASH and all the Grisham movies when I was 8 and 10 and 12. And so I just don't think I ever created a real fantasy ability in my head to make up super interesting and unique worlds. And instead I just always kind of fell into the drama of the world as it sort of existed. And that was what intrigued me.
So you kind of went down that route. And do you kind of run it, presumably do you run it past somebody that can kind of give you a heads up on anything that might be out of place or is not going to fly?
Definitely. I have so many lawyers who are in my close circle of family and friends. And so I started with my buddy who told me about this place. And then my Aunt Kathy is a defense attorney for 30 years and tried a lot of murder cases. So in California, not in Texas, but so she's very knowledgeable, and she was incredibly helpful as I was crafting the story, and then also read early drafts of it and helped me with some of the jargon and told me where I was sort of missing the mark a little bit with the legal stuff.
Well, that's great. And so obviously you write for a living anyway. What do you think you've kind of, before you got to writing this first book, what do you think you kind of learned from writing professionally in general, regardless of the format that you're writing in? What sort of lessons have you learned along the way that you've then been able to apply to this part of the process?
Yeah. Well, I was really lucky. So the first TV show I worked on was The Good Fight, which was a spinoff of The Good Wife. Mm-hmm. And Robert and Michelle King, who had created the original, were also showrunning this. And so they had 7 years of experience of 24 or 22 episodes a year, just always finding interesting legal stories. And their shows have a lot of plot. And so they move very, very quickly through a lot of story. And so working in their writer's room with a room full of talented writers, some of whom were lawyers, I just got to see firsthand how you break a legal story over and over and over again every week. And so when I came to do The Local, I realized, this is one case, and I get to do a deeper dive into it than maybe one episode of television would do. But in some ways, it felt a lot more manageable than trying to break a new incredible case every single week. So I got to apply a lot of those lessons.
And did you, in terms of actual writing things, I mean, did you find that when you started writing, I mean, I don't know whether The Locals, I know The Local is your debut novel, but was it actually the first novel that you tried to write? Because often it's not with people when they get published. It
was. I mean, obviously I've been writing for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years at this point, and professionally for maybe about 7. So I've done a lot of feature. I certainly have any number of scripts that nobody will ever see and will never get produced. But yeah, this was my first shot at it.
Over and over again. Well, the reason I asked that is more to do with, did you find that when you started writing The Local, over the period that you were writing it, were there things that you kind of had to shake off in terms of things that you would just do as without even thinking about it as regards screenwriting things like dialogue, for example, because, you know, were you sort of just tempted to, or did you find yourself having to pare back the dialogue at all, or add more narrative and you know, those sorts of things?
Yeah. Well, I tend to think in terms of dialogue. So even when I do outlines, like outlines for screenplays and teleplays are often very, very minimal in the dialogue, and mine will have a lot more just because that's just how I think. So the first choice I made when I decided to write this as a novel was to tell it in the first person. And the reason I wanted to do that was it felt like I was just writing dialogue the whole time. So even though I did have to write something of prose and descriptions of things, it was all from the character's point of view. So it sort of felt more natural to me to do it that way than if I were writing it in the third person.
That's actually, that's a good comment. Actually, I hadn't thought of that. Maybe that's why my first novel is in first person. That's a good point. And did you find? I mean, obviously, in terms of your novels written in past tense, obviously screenplays are usually written in present tense. Was that a shift for you initially as well?
It totally was. It's almost, I've done a lot of I've taught some undergraduate screenwriting courses as well, and so I have been a young screenwriter in academia, and I've also seen a lot of them, and that's one of the hardest things to start with screenwriting. It's just one of the rules that people bump on, but everything is told in the present tense, and so you really start. So after 15 years of he enters, he sits, to do it in the past tense felt really awkward. And my like logical brain kind of doesn't understand. I mean, for instance, if your narrator, if their life is in danger and they could potentially die at the end of the book, I don't understand how they're telling this story in the past tense, but I just had to get over that and just do it because I know that's the convention. So
I think that's why,
natural.
Yeah. Well, I it's weird because I've kind of ended up writing most of my stuff is in present tense, and I think it's for that reason, because I have don't get me wrong, I haven't done anything successfully with scripts or anything, but I do it with my job, and I've written like short films and things like that. So I like writing dialogue, and I like writing scripts. But as a consequence, I found even when I've tried to do it in past tense, I'll often keep slipping back into present tense for that very reason. So in the end, I just embraced it and kind of went with it. But it can, it can get quite kind of full on. And sometimes I wish, actually, this would be easier if it was in past tense. And then you always get into more difficulty if you do a flashback, and then that needs to be in past tense, and you can kind of get really tripped up by it. But I did wonder with that. And so, did you tend to, I suppose the fact that it's in first person kind of negated that, but did you find when you were editing and things, did you end up stripping out lots of dialogue, or did you find that did you have instances where you'd written sort of pages and pages of dialogue where you just kind of got into the scene?
It was actually one of the few times where the editing process didn't make it a whole lot shorter. I think the book now is about 90 or 93,000, and the first draft actually might have come in at like 88 or so. So it wasn't. I don't think I had written a lot of dialogue that I pared down, but more concerning for me was the descriptions of things, because in screenwriting usually lean is better, and I'm definitely one of the types of screenwriters who's very happy to hand a script over to a director and an actor and set design and costume and everybody else, and let them do their thing without a lot of direction from the script. And obviously, when you're writing a book, that's all that anybody has to take. So the idea of describing things, so that was sort of a daunting task, because I don't want to say I've become lazy, but maybe that's true. But I've definitely become very comfortable in handing it over to other artists and letting them actually paint the full picture.
Imagine it.
So I had never done that.
Yeah. So that's interesting. And what do you think? So if you were talking to some of your other screenwriting friends now, and maybe they were thinking about writing a book rather than a script, they were writing the first novel, what advice would you give to them? Are there kind of pitfalls they kind of need to avoid, or would there be certain ways to approach it, do you think?
Yeah, the first thing I would say if I talked to a screenwriter who was thinking about doing it is I would just encourage them to do it, because I found it to be a really rewarding form of writing. And I think I love screenwriting, and I hope that will be sort of my major career for the rest of my life. But it is really fun and rewarding to get to collaborate with other people. But the one thing that you do lose along the way sometimes is just sort of your own version of the story. And often the story is far better because it involves other people's visions as well. But there is, at least for me, I had the desire to sort of kind of shrink everything down and just simply tell the story that I wanted to tell. And this was kind of the one way I think I was ever going to get to do that. And so I found it really rewarding, and I really hope that I get to do both for a long time, because going back and forth from writing books to writing scripts would I think balance that out really nicely.
Yeah, you get to kind of do both things. Famously, people talk about, I forget what the actual saying is, but screenplays are structure, or however the saying goes. So with that in mind, when it comes to writing the novel, would you say you're a planner and you like to outline everything, or is it a bit more seat of the pants type stuff?
No, I'm definitely a planner. I followed pretty much the same format that I do for a script. So I started with dry erase boards with whiteboards, and I just kind of sketched out the timeline and what I wanted the story to be in the major beats. And then I wrote an outline, especially because my work often has so much research involved. I like to create an outline that has dialogue, that has descriptions, that has every scene I'm going to write, and that I can put all of my notes and I put all my notes, all my research into that one document, so that ideally when I'm writing the script or the book, I don't have to refer to anything other than the outline. So I did a pretty extensive outline, which probably, I think it took longer to write the outline than it did the first draft of the book.
Yeah, so it was pretty detailed. Do you use Scrivener or something for that, for the actual writing of the book?
I did. I'm not that technically literate, and so I tried not to. And I think I started in Word, and I did about 8,000 or 10,000 words, and then I started having trouble. And my wife said, "Well, you should use Scrivener." And I said, "I can't learn a new program. It's just too complicated." And I got very impatient, and she sat me down and was very kind, and she showed me how to use it. And now I love it. Now it totally makes sense to my brain. I love being able to see all the chapters.
It's not that complicated either, is it? It just seems complicated when you first sit down.
It does.
Because it looks so different to, say, Word.
It does.
But now the idea of me, I'm the same with now the thought of going back to Word to write a book seems just crazy now, especially when you start to edit, or the fact that you can just grab things and move them around and whatever.
It's so manageable. And then like once I get to the editing phase with your publisher, they put it in Word, and you're like, I don't want to do this in Word anymore.
That still hasn't changed. Yeah, I know.
No,
I don't know why that hasn't changed. It doesn't matter who I speak to. And obviously you always get your edits back in Word, and then you get this horrible, you basically just have to, it seems like the kind of consensus is that you more or less just have to stay in Word once you get to the editing phase, which is a bit irritating, but we can't shift editors over to Scrivener yet, so we'll keep moaning about it.
Not yet. We will,
and maybe eventually, we'll get them to do that.
I hope so.
So I don't know whether you've started thinking about it yet, or whether you're working on it. But when it comes to the next book, do you think you'll approach it any differently? What have you learned from writing The Local?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my hope would be that this book does well enough that I could write another installment of these characters. I have a couple other ideas for installments of this story. Mm-hmm. And so one reason I would like to do that is I rarely get to return to characters. I mean, because I've worked on TV shows, we certainly deal with the same characters episode to episode, but usually I write one script in a season. And so it is really fun to get to evolve with characters and to ask myself, where is this guy 2 years later, and what are the other things I can put him through? So I would really like to do that. I would like to write other books as well, but I'd be super happy if I could revisit East Texas and James Euchre. And as far as lessons that I learned from the first go around, man, it is really all a blur. I started writing it right around the time the pandemic started, and then I got it sold, and I think my wife was 7 months pregnant, and I got my first round of notes like the day after my son was born. And so I did all my revisions in this like fog.
Nice.
But it was a very rewarding experience, and working with my editor and working with all the people that I got to, it was kinder and gentler than working in Hollywood. So I was going to ask you that. What were the kind of differences between the publishing world and the world, the writing room, the writer's room, or whatever? Yeah, well, so my editor, Rob Bloom, he sent me his first round of notes, and he sent me this note along with it, and he said, these are all just suggestions. I love your book. We obviously are huge fans. Take what you want, change what you want, ignore what you want. And I'm so used to being, and it's fine, but in screenwriting and in television, someone is really footing a big bill, and they hire you. I mean, you're not even the author. You don't own the material, and
No, the IP.
you're hired to do what they want. So yeah, I mean, you get to collaborate, and I've done 2 movies. Rob Reiner was the director, and he was incredibly generous and always a kind collaborator, but it's his at the end of the day. So he always wanted my point of view, but it's his work. So this was the one time where I really felt like, oh, I am the author of this, and my vision is probably gets the final say, and so that was a fun experience.
It's a bit like being a showrunner, isn't it, really? The writing the book, in a way, especially if you're thinking with a view to potentially writing more books in the series and things. As I say, you're basically creating the whole world, and that outline for the first book is essentially like your show Bible almost.
It is. I mean, it's so funny because as a showrunner, like you do have sort of the vision for the whole season, but there's a writer's room, so you have so many people weighing in and helping you craft the story and just creating these characters and everything. And then there's so many rounds of notes. There's executive producers, there's a studio, there's the network. And like I said, I do feel like the projects always get better through those notes process. And that actually made it somewhat daunting to do the book, because there were so few people weighing in before it went out. I thought, there is a certain level of confidence. Yeah, exactly. Like, this is definitely going to be on me, and did enough people see this and weigh in before we sent it out to the world? So, yeah,
that's interesting. And do you find I mean, sounds like it wasn't an issue as regards the editing process for the book, but in those writers' room experiences, do you find that you have to fight your corner sometimes? Do you have to stand up for an idea or a suggestion, or is it very much, well, I'm a hired hand here, so if someone says make that change, you just make the change?
Yeah, it's a little of both. I mean, I definitely always try to be mindful of my place in the project. And when I'm working on somebody else's show, the showrunner, it's their show, it's their vision, and so I think you're there to serve them and try to help them tell the best version of their story that they want. Occasionally, I think there are things that really are important to writers, and it usually, in a writer's room, I think those moments tend to be when a writer identifies with a character, possibly more so than some of the other writers that identify with that character, and it becomes more important. And then I think sort of incumbent on the rest of the room to notice that and to pay attention and to listen to the person whose perspective is most valuable. But aside from that, most of the time it should just be a nice conversation where everyone gets their point of view. But then I always want to be able to be heard, and that's sort of the end of it. So as long as the people are willing to listen, that's good enough for me. And then I'll take my direction from the people who pay me. Yeah,
which is kind of good advice. So if you could start again tomorrow with your writing career in general, what would you tell your younger self? Would you do anything differently? Would you give yourself a kind of pep talk or any specific advice, do you think?
I think, I mean, I'm very happy with where I am now. I think the best advice for me when I was younger would have been write a little bit more, write a little bit faster, and just, I don't think I was patient. I think I was a little bit complacent at times. So you do have to be patient, because if you set out to do it and you give yourself 12 months, you likely won't achieve what you want in 12 months, and it's not enough time. But at the same time, I don't think there's a lot of young writers, especially screenwriters who come to LA, that if they were told, well, it's going to take 10 years, would say, that's great. Let's find an apartment and hunker down. Yeah. So, but yeah, I wish I had written just a little bit more and worked a little bit harder in those early years, because they dragged on for quite some time.
What do you think you learned? Is it a case you kind of learned through doing? So do you think those early kind of screenplays that you were writing, do you think that's kind of where you did a lot of your kind of early learning? What sorts of things did you pick up along the way, do you think? What were some of the mistakes that you made in those early things? Yeah,
for sure. One was definitely writing things that I didn't want to write. And it's easy to fall into that trap, either because you're seeing things that are successful and you think, well, I want to be successful, so maybe I should try to emulate that. Or even worse is you have producers or agents or managers who are in your ear trying to help you be successful, and they're doing the same thing, and they're pointing you at types of projects that aren't necessarily what you want to write. And usually the things that you don't want to write are the things that you're not going to write as well either. And that was certainly the case with me. So I came in sort of with a couple scripts about political things and lawyers, and then was told, drama as far as movies is sort of dead right now. Write high concept comedies, and I'm not a comedy writer, or write an action thriller, and I'm not really an action thriller writer.
Yeah.
And consequently, those scripts were not very good. And it wasn't until until basically the phone stopped ringing and I hadn't sold anything and no one really cared what I was doing, that I wrote something that I really wanted to write. And that ended up being the thing that got me some attention. And so I think the lesson I want to take from myself, because it was the same with the local, was if a year or two goes by and things slow down, to really look inside and ask, like, what is it that if I could tell one story, what is the one story that I want to tell? And then just do that and be comfortable enough knowing that that'll probably be my best work and it'll be my best foot forward.
Yeah, something that you're passionate about and that's got something of you in it.
Yeah, definitely.
What's the best piece of creative advice that you've been given yourself along the way? And it might not be really specific writing advice. It might just be something that helped you at a time when you were struggling, maybe.
Yeah. I always just say that the more good writing you do, the more chances to get lucky you're giving yourself. Because I think, I got my master's in screenwriting at UCLA. And so that was a 2-year program, and we would have guest lecturers come all the time. And basically, you'd have a professional screenwriter talking to 50 students who wanted to become screenwriters. And the entire Q&A, the subtext was always, how do I get to where you are? And the answer was always, well, you're never going to do it this way. And it's always frustrating to hear. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think you can follow certain paths, but I think, to me, one of the points is so much is out of your control, and that's really frustrating and often really unfair. But the one thing that you can control is writing projects, finishing projects, polishing them so they're in really good shape, and then doing it again and just doing your best to either not get discouraged or to not let being discouraged impede your progress.
Basically, just keep doing the work, essentially.
Yeah.
So that when you get the chance to be lucky, you're actually ready to take the opportunity when it comes your way.
Definitely. And I say that as somebody who took years off from, I'm not one of those people who claims I get up every morning and I write for 4 hours because that's just what I need to do. It's like breathing. Like that's not me at all. I definitely am responsible for the slow process that my career took. But I do think that it's, and hopefully if you're writing and that's your dream, is to be a professional writer, you actually enjoy the process of writing. So there's something rewarding to doing it, even if no one else is reading it.
I think that's really important. Yeah, for sure. So have you kind of you mentioned there, you certainly weren't that person that's kind of got to get up and I'm going to do full. Have you got a kind of process now? Do you have, are there things that you do to get into the zone with your writing, or is it very much a case of, well, I've got this bunch of stuff that I need to do and it's just the same as anybody else, just going to work each day and off you go and doing the work?
Yeah, for the creative process, for me, the outlining and the first draft are the most creative moments for me, and so it requires a certain clarity in my mind. So I always do it first thing in the morning. So I like to get up when the world hasn't bothered me yet and doesn't need anything from me, and I'll write for a few hours, and then I usually hit a wall where I can just feel that it's not as good, and then I'll just come back to it tomorrow. So when I wrote the local, it was the only thing I was working on at the time. So that's what I did. I would get up at about 6 a.m, and I never would write past noon, and rarely would I get to noon. But I write 7 days a week when I'm doing that, just because it's like exercising. Like I just don't want to take any time off. I just don't want to get out of the zone. And then the rewriting I find doesn't require that same creative energy. So I can do that for several more hours in the day, but it's sort of for me kind of, and now that I'm working on a TV show and that I'm show running this show, that there are a lot of those tasks that that I can do any time of day. So I try to be very precious about finding the creative hours where I have some silence and some quiet, and I can do the actual writing that I need to do, because that's sort of the most important part of the job at the end of the day.
Yeah. Are you or will you be actively pitching the local as a potential project for the screen, do you think, or are you already working on that?
Will. Yeah, I actually, so some of the first people to read it were a producer named Liz Glotzer, and she works at King Size Productions, which is where Robert and Michelle King, who created The Good Fight and The Good Wife, it's their company. And so Michelle read it as well. So they read early copies of it before it was published, and they really, really liked it. So I've partnered up with them and their production company, and the idea was that we were going to take it out and pitch it this past summer, but then we all got busy with other things. I think we'll probably do it early next year, but I hope to take it out and have a shot to turn it into a TV show, hopefully sometime in 2023.
Yeah, that'd be great. So can you give us a hint of what you might be working on going forward? Have you got a project? I'm not asking you to tell me the name and stuff. Obviously the local's only just coming out here, but
Sure.
Just give us a sense of what you're working on, what's coming up.
Sure. So right now I'm working on the second season of a show called Your Honor, which stars Bryan Cranston. It was on
Great
Showtime.
show. I saw the first series. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So that one that was created by Peter Moffat, and it was a COVID show. So it started before the pandemic and then got shut down and then picked up. So it was a very long production, but finally made it to screen, and it did really well and people liked it. So there's a second season, and yeah, that pretty much has my undivided attention for probably the remainder of the year, and it should start airing, I think, in December of 2022. And then I would like to turn to the local and pitch that as the TV series, and hopefully by then there will be enough positive response to the book that I can really start diving into the next chapter, because I do know what I want it to be, and I toyed with starting the second book, but then I got really busy, and I also got really scared. I thought, if I do that, am I going to jinx myself, or is it going to be a waste of time? And I didn't want to do any of that. So I just did a lot of the planning in my head. And I thought, if the call comes, I'll be ready to go.
You'll be ready to go. Yeah. You'll be ready to pick up the call. Well, that's great. Well, just before we sign off, can you just tell us where people can find out a little bit more about you, where they can find you online, and obviously tell them where they can find the local?
Sure. My website is joeyhartstone.com, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram at JC Hartstone. And yeah, you can find the local. It just got published in the UK a few days ago, and you can find it hopefully at local bookstores, or here on Amazon, or at Pushkin or Penguin Random House, depending on where you are in the world.
Everywhere you can find good books, basically.
I hope so, yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, good luck with it. I'm looking forward to finishing the book. I'm really enjoying it. But for now, it's been great to chat to you, Joey. Thanks for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Thank you so much for having me. I've had a blast.
Joined up writing.
Okay, thanks again to Joey, and I'll put all of his links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk, or you can find them in the podcast description on whatever device you're listening to this on. That's pretty much it for this week, but don't forget to get in touch with all your thoughts on the show, your feedback, and to tell me what's going on in your writing world. And you can do that by dropping me an email at wayne@waynekellyWrites.com. Also, remember you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever else you're listening to this. And that way you can have the podcast downloaded automatically every single time. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else, because it really does help other people find the show, other people's. And, you could just recommend it to one of your friends. Other than that, that's it for this week. So thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.